believe it? There's no bloody credit on that record. Hi, my name is James Griffiths. Welcome to another video, and today I'm going to be doing my countdown of my top 20 favourite albums from 1974. These are albums which are due to turn 50 years old this year. So I was inspired to make this video by Steve Whitty, who did a top 10 recently. Steve had some great choices. I'm going to repeat some of them, not going to repeat all of them. There are some on his list that could have made my list on a different day. There was some on his list that I'd never actually heard before, so I need to do some catching up with that. But do check out Steve's video because he has a slightly alternative take on it. So I thought I would do a rough top 20. I mean, don't take the ordering too seriously. I've tried to, the nearer the top we get into the top 10, I've tried to reflect what my actual opinions are with regards to these albums or how much they mean to me. It is a very personal list. I was working out actually, 1974 was the first year that I became aware of music. I was 3 years old, I had a little Danzet record player and a pile of 45 records that came with it because it was bought second hand, but none of the records I had were from 1974, all of them were pre-1974. So I was looking down my list here and working out which was the first 1974 album which I ever actually heard, and remarkably, or perhaps not too remarkably, it's my number one choice. So we'll get to that in due course. Okay, number 20 dates back to 1987, The Scorpions and Fly to the Rainbow, which I believe is their second album. This is one of the first hard rock albums I ever bought. I'd heard the track The Zoo from the Worldwide Live album on the Tommy Vance Friday Rock Show, and just thought it was incredible. I picked up, actually this might have been the first record by them I picked up. I know I picked up Savage Amusement, which was the album that came out in '87, but I hurried down to Phase 1 Records in Wrexham, the shop that was then owned by Alan Hughes, and it was a great shop. Picked this up in my lunch break. I was at sixth form college, and I remember I went to the orthodontist straight afterwards. I was having some dental treatment. I had a brace on my teeth, and I took this into the room with me, and the orthodontist, who was this nice lady, she sort of looked at it and said, "What's that?" I said, "It's the Scorpions," and she said, "What kind of music is it?" And we had a little conversation. I don't think this is a very well regarded record. I heard Robert Fithen, I think, talking about it a while back, and he seemed to be saying this is not one of their best albums. It is quite progressive. The opening track, Speedy's Coming, it has got one of the greatest sort of raucous guitar sounds you'll ever hear. It's so raw. They Need a Million, the second song, has got a bit of a Spanish flavour. Drifting Sun is a good song as well, and Fly People Fly at the end of side 1 is great. Side 2 is a bit lesser, but the album does end with a bit of an epic with the title track. It's I'm not going to make any great claims for it, like this is one of the greatest albums of 1974, but it's certainly one which has some kind of significance to my musical journey. So I thought I'd have to choose that one. This one, a more recent discovery really, probably in the last 10 years or so, but I pulled it out about 4 months ago. We'd moved into this house and I'd been without my stereo, my hi-fi, for a long time. I'd left it in the other house. When I finally plugged it in and set it up, I pulled out some records to play that I hadn't heard for a long time, and this was one of them, and I really, really enjoyed it. Cockney Rebel and the Psychomodo, which I think was their second album. Probably not as good as their first album. I don't think the band were that happy with it. I think they thought the first album was better. But this album has got some top stuff on it. It starts with Sweet Dreams, and then the title track, Psychomodo, is fantastic. Mr. Soft, Singular Band, and Ritz on side 1, all top stuff. Cavaliers on side 2, 8.5 minutes. It's quite hard work. It's quite repetitive. Steve Harley, he was quite a provocative artist, really. He sings in this way. It's almost like a deliberately crap voice. He's a sort of mixture of Bob Dylan, Ray Davis, and a couple of other people whose names won't spring to mind now, but quite arty, quite left field, lyrically interesting, quite off the wall, great band. Arrangements on this record by the great Andrew Powell, who I think went on to work with, did he work with Kate Bush? He worked with quite a few other people later on. So yeah, I thought I would include this. An interesting group, an interesting musician, you know, an interesting artist in Steve Harley. He doesn't get too much attention, but great band as well. Stuart Elliott on drums and percussion, who I think was also in Kate's band, wasn't he? Kate Bush's band early on. So yeah, great stuff. Cockney Rebel, the Psychomodo from 1974. At number 18 is a record that I know John Heaton is a fan of, and I've always really liked this one too. Not going to make any claims for it as being in one of Dylan's top echelon albums, but I've always been fond of Planet Waves. First heard it on CD in the 1990s, and I think John was saying in a recent video, it's not necessarily the songs on this record that are great, it's just the band who are playing on the record, and it's the band, of course. And there's some really, really great musicianship on here, of course, with it being the band. Robbie Robertson does some really, really great guitar, and there are some nice songs on here. You've got the two versions of Forever Young, but you've also got Hazel on side 1 is a bit of a Lost Dylan classic. You Angel You on side 2 is a nice little pop song. I think it's a really nice record. I think it's one that does belong in any collection. You know, a person who likes Bob Dylan, I think it would be a shame to only have the Blood on the Tracks and the Highway 61s, etc. I think you need a bit of Planet Waves, and the band do a sterling job of backing Bob up on that record. So that was number 18, and then at number 17 is a record I don't think many people would have this in their top 20, and it's not a perfect album, it does have its faults, but it's one that I am fond of, and I thought it did deserve its place. George Harrison, this is his album Dark Horse. It's a later reissue on Music for Pleasure. It doesn't have the original artwork. I've always quite liked that cover though. I think it's quite an appealing cover with George on the park bench with his big furry boots. So this album obviously came from quite a troubled part of George's career, where his health was starting to slide. He was too busy. He was doing a tour. He was trying to record an album. He was working with the Splinter Project. He was taking too many drugs, drinking too much, losing his voice, all kinds of things going on. And what really lets this album down really is the production and the mixing. Really doesn't sound like it's been mixed at all really. All the instruments are at the same level. George's voice has not been bedded into the tracks properly. It's kind of really stark and ragged. It's interesting though, because when Neil Young does that, say on an album like Tonight's the Night, he gets all these plaudits, but George gets knocked, you know. Not all the material is top drawer, but side 1 doesn't put a foot wrong, really. Harry's on Tour, the opening instrumental is great. So Sad is one of George's finest songs from his career. Side 2 has the failed hit single Ding Dong Ding Dong, which was George's attempt to do a kind of Slade Wizard Christmas song. It's good fun, but it was a flop. The track Dark Horse, which is good, and Far East Man, again, is one of George's most beautiful songs. It does have a kind of ragged spirit to it, this record, but I do think it's a bit underrated, really, and it's an album that I've been fond of for a great many years, so I thought that's why it deserved its place in my list. So, coming in at number 16, this is one of those records that you just throw on with a beer or a glass of wine and just have a good time to. And of all the records by this artist, I don't know if it's my favourite, but it is my go-to album, really, by Ry Cooder, and this is Paradise and Lunch, which sounds like most of his other 1970s albums, to be fair, but there's something about this one. Great lineup of musicians. You've got Jim Keltner on drums, Milt Holland on drums as well. My favourite song off this record, well, there's a couple on side 1 actually. Married Man's a Fool, Mexican Divorce, fantastic. Great version of It's All Over Now. And then on side 2, featuring Earl Hines on piano, you've got a great version of Diddy Wah Ditty, Jesus on the main line at the end. Like I said, it's just a record that you have a beer and listen to it, and it'll always get a room grooving away. Ry's great slide playing on there, and yeah, I think one of his best albums for certain. Now this is an album very, very different from that one, and it's more of a singer-songwriter album really, and this is a record that I showed in one of the first videos I ever made when I started making videos back, I think it was about 7 years ago. I made a video called Comfort Blanket Albums, and this is one that I always reach for when I want a bit of soul food really. Jackson Browne, Late for the Sky, which is a remarkable album really. Just the lyrical depth to it, I suppose, and just a sense of melancholy which comes through the tracks. Great musicianship from his band. You've got David Lindley on electric guitar, slide and fiddle, and just these great sort of rolling epic songs on side 1, Late for the Sky, Fountain of Sorrow, and The Late Show at the end of side 1, just beautiful. On side 2 you've got the great closing song, Before the Deluge, and a couple of rocking songs as well, including The Road and the Sky, the opening song on side 1. It's a great album. I think it does tend to turn up in those lists of the greatest albums of all time, with some just wonderful lyrical writing, and it's one that I need to do a feature on at some point. The cover was inspired by a painting by the French surrealist artist Magritte, and I think it's the Late Show at the end of side 1, doesn't it? That contains a reference to being in a car outside, waiting outside in the car, and I just love the iconography of that and just the artwork, and just great songs. I saw Jackson Browne live back in the day. It would have been back in the early noughties. I saw him at I think it was the Liverpool Empire, and it wasn't a very rocking show at all. It was one of the most pedestrian shows I've ever seen, really, but the songwriting did come through. So coming in at number 14, we have an album again which I discovered in the late 90s, reading a music magazine, and there was an article, I think it was probably Q or Mojo. I knew who this guy was because he'd produced the first album by my favourite band, Squeeze, so I knew his name, but I didn't know much about him. I can't remember if I'd heard the Velvet Underground at this point. But it was John Cale, and I was reading this article thinking these records sound really essential. So I nipped up the road. I lived at the time about a mile away from a really great little second-hand CD, I think it was just a CD shop called Polar Bear in Headingley in Leeds, and flipped through their section on John Cale. This was one that jumped out at me as having an interesting cover, so I bought it, picked it up. This comes from 1974, but it's remarkable listening to it. It doesn't sound like much else that was happening in 1974. John Cale was doing post-punk really before punk happened. I guess he was in the original vanguard of what they originally called punk back in the late 1960s with the Velvets, but this has a very direct, raw kind of sound. The opening song, Fear is a Man's Best Friend, with that pounding piano and all his primal shrieks at the end, it's just totally remarkable. Nothing like his classic album, which everybody talks about, which is Paris 1919. It's got a totally different kind of vibe to it, slightly unhinged, on the edge. You know, I think Cale was living in England by this time, and I think he had some substance abuse problems going on, and you know, there's a definite kind of living on the edge feel to some of these tracks. You've got Phil Manzanera, of course, on guitar on this album, and yeah, it's just fantastic. Gun at the start of side 1, like I said, very close to the bone, edgy, angry kind of music, and a totally essential album from 1974. Okay, so coming in at number 13, we have an album which I think is a bit of a sleeper in this guy's catalogue. It's often lost in the shuffle a little bit, and this is Stevie Wonder and Fulfillingness's first finale, which tends not to get the plaudits of Innervisions, certainly not the plaudits of Songs in the Key of Life, maybe because it's more of a sombre record, really. It does have a few funky moments, so you've got on side 1 you've got Boogie on Reggae Woman, which it's not up there with Superstition, but it's not too far behind. But then you've got these kind of slow burn tracks like Heaven Is 10 Zillion Light Years Away, Creeping at the end of side 1, which I think that's the song that's got Minnie Riperton singing on it. His partner, or was it wife at the time, Cyrita, she turns up on there singing on Bird of Beauty, I think. Just got some great slow burn stuff. It Ain't No Use. Bit of a political thing going on, as usual, on Stevie's albums, with that great song You Haven't Done Nothing at the start of side 2. It's always been one which has appealed to me because the songs are not too played out. You know, if you listen to Innervisions or Talking Book, or you know, Songs from the Key of Life, the songs from those records tend to be very familiar, but this is one which does slip under the radar a little bit, and I think that is undeserved, really, because I think it's a great entry in his catalogue. So there's Stevie coming in at number 12. Now this next one, just to be provocative, I nearly put it at number 1, because it is a fantastic album, and speaking objectively, looking at these albums, trying to be objective, it probably is the most artistically rewarding and the most original, the most innovative and visionary album of all of them. The caveat I've got about it, and the reason it falls down the list a little bit for me personally is that it's one of those albums that I do have to be in the mood for it. I have to be in the mood for his voice, I have to be in the mood for the production and the arrangements. Robert Wyatt and Rock Bottom, which is the album he made shortly after falling from a top floor window and breaking his spine, I think, ended up in a wheelchair. The record was produced by Nick Mason, and Robert drew on some friends of his. You've got Mike Oldfield on this, you've got Hugh Hopper, various people from the Canterbury scene, but it's an extremely strange and original album. Side 1 is stronger for me. Side 2, I think, starts to veer off into territory which is a bit uncomfortable at times sonically, but side 1 is truly remarkable, and you can strap on a pair of headphones, whack it up loud, have a candle lit, and this album will really take you somewhere else. Extremely original. The textures, I think, were probably quite influential later on, even on some electronic bands of the 1990s. You know, I hear shades of Orbital in some of the synth work on this record, so a bit of a subaquatic theme coming through in both the music and the album artwork, which of course was drawn by Robert's wife. So yeah, I wanted to put it at number 1, but I thought in the end I won't put it at number 1. It could have come higher in the list on a different day, but like I said, I do have to be in the mood for that. So that's Robert Wyatt and Rock Bottom, another one that I discovered in the 90s, and it would have been on CD. Okay, so we're nearly in the top 10. Now this album just missed out on the top 10 because I do find a couple of the tracks a little bit annoying, but I kind of think that's sort of the point of the album and of the band, really. This is one that Steve had in his list. This is 10cc and Sheet Music. Their second album, it's the band's own favourite album, I think. When I interviewed, or I was part of an interview with Kevin Godley last year, that video is on my channel if you want to check that out. He said it was his favourite album by the band, and the song that he name-checked as his favourite song of all time in that interview, I think, was Somewhere in Hollywood, which is a great track. I mean, this album it's like a sort of mixture of the Beatles, Frank Zappa, Monty Python. It's all over the place. I think the best cut on it is The Worst Band in the World, which is so funny. It's so subversive, and there's an awful lot of mockery going on there. Self-mockery, mockery of the record industry. Old Wild Men, which is an extremely beautiful elegiac song, looking forward into the future, to the time that we're now living in now, ironically, where, you know, all the rock stars are in their dotage. Yeah, so you've got these songs that are a little bit annoying. Clockwork Creep at the end of side 1, it's good. It's good, but it is a little bit annoying. And Baron Samedi as well. I don't know. I think sometimes they just get a little bit too pleased with themselves, but it's still a great album. It would have to be just hovering just outside my top 10, I think. My personal favourite of theirs is the next one, the original soundtrack, but yeah, I couldn't leave out 10cc, so there it is, Sheet Music, coming in at number 11. So, moving up to the top 10. This was a record that I got really into in the early noughties. There's a bit of a story behind it, which I won't bore you with now, but David Bowie, Diamond Dogs, which of course is Richard McCook's favourite album of all time. There's definitely something about this album, a kind of dark, apocalyptic thing. The glam rock thing has come to an end, and Bowie is just occupying this sort of strange hinterland. He's not moving forward yet into the kind of European Germanic stuff, or even into the American style soul stuff, which he was going to do on Young Americans. But the glam thing is kind of lying in tatters, and he's just, I don't know, just taking a step into this very dark, dystopian world. It's side 2 of this record that I just absolutely love. The track 1984, and the way it comes out of We Are the Dead. 1984 is like a blaxploitation kind of track with kind of bongos and wah-wah guitar. It's just fantastic. There's something very 1970s about it. It does take me back to those days. I was a kid at the time, of course. I did want to put this in the list and have it quite high in the list because it is one that I got really into back in the day. Of course, Bowie himself played the guitar on this album rather than relying on Mick Ronson or whoever, and the guitar is quite back to basics. It's quite raw. It's got that kind of Keith Richards swagger. There we go, Bowie coming in at number 10. Okay, coming in at number 9, we have an album which has massively grown on me over the last few years. It's a record that I always liked, but it wasn't one that it wasn't a go-to record for me until maybe even last year or the year before. And this is John Lennon and Walls and Bridges from 1974, which was the final album he made before disappearing off to the Dakota with Yoko and Sean for 5 years and becoming a house husband. This record has got a bit of an American sound to it, got a bit of a funky sound, got the horns on there. You've got Elton John, of course, on the big hit single, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, which is not my favourite song on the album by a long chalk. Some quite dark stuff on this album. You've got Scared at the end of side 1, which is almost a throwback to some of the Plastic Ono Band stuff you've been doing at the start of the decade. Very honest song. And you know, I think at the time John was probably reaching the end of his rope in terms of how much more he was willing to put up with. I think he was wanting to go back behind the drawbridge, and there were certain things happening. He was ready to take a break from it all. Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out at the end of side 2, I think, is a really underrated London classic. Actually, it's not one that gets a huge amount of attention compared to other songs. But you've got number 9, Dream, at the start of side 1, which for me totally outdoes Imagine. I think it's just a more beguiling song, just totally mesmerising arrangements and production. Steel and Glass is a bit of a rip-off of How Do You Sleep, I suppose, but What You Got on side 1 is nice and funky. Surprise, Surprise, Sweet Bird of Paradox on side 2 is just a delightful song, I think. It's kind of upbeat and sunny. Bit of a mixture of moods on this record, up and down, but I do think it's a record which gets a bit overlooked, so I thought I would have it in the list and have it quite high as well. So there we go, John Lennon and Walls and Bridges coming in at number 9. Now, number 8 is a record that I don't think will feature in many people's lists. Maybe Jeff at Calico Silver, I know he's a fan. I did a whole video on this guy a couple of years back, and this is an album which I totally love. This is Jimmy Webb, get it the right way around. This is Jimmy Webb and Land's End, which I think is maybe his 3rd or 4th album. Jimmy Webb, of course, the singer who really made his name writing songs for other people, really, you know, Glenn Campbell, etc., etc. I first cottoned on to him. I think I'd seen Paddy Muckaloon from Prefab Sprout doing a concert with him, doing some kind of guest appearance with him, and I thought, wow, great song. His albums at the time, you could pick them up in charity shops for next to nothing. They've completely disappeared now. I don't know if that means anything, whether people have cottoned on to the fact that Jimmy was a really quality artist. He's maybe got this middle of the road kind of veneer to him, but there's a lot of lyrical depth on these records. This one in particular is musically extremely beautiful. You've got some fantastic songs. Lady Fits Her Blue Jeans is just a wonderful song, almost a piece of reportage, really, just describing what this girl is doing in her bathroom and she's getting ready to go out in the morning. Crying in My Sleep, incredibly dark song, you know. Some of these songs are best enjoyed kind of sinking into a whiskey bottle, the real kind of dark night of the soul kind of songs. And Asleep on the Wind at the end has got this huge orchestral arrangement. I just think it's a really remarkable album, and it's not one that really ends up in any people's lists, really. And Jimmy Webb doesn't get a huge amount of love, but this album is just brilliant, I think, and it's my favourite. I think I did a Jimmy Webb ranking. That was the video I did. I think I had this one at number 1. I think I did. I can't be absolutely certain, but it's certainly a great piece of work. So Jimmy Webb and Land's End coming in at number 8. Didn't quite know where to place this one. It could have gone higher, really. Certainly a band that would have to be in the top 10. Again, they were in Steve's list, but don't think he had this one in his list. Queen 2, their 2nd album. This is one of the ones that I had as a kid. I always loved side 1, strangely enough, because side 2 is meant to be the side that you know, is the big fantastic side of music, all composed by Freddie Mercury, and it is fantastic. In more recent years I've grown to appreciate it, but I always used to love the Brian May songs on this album. Father to Son at the start of side 1, going into White Queen. Just beautiful, really well crafted songs, and this great Roy Thomas Baker production. Trident Studios, of course. They hadn't been happy with the sound on the first album they'd done at Trident. They'd been forced to do certain things like having tape on the drums and having lots of separation booths and that kind of thing. For this album they insisted on recording the way they wanted to, and they got this great big cavernous sound. Yeah, I mean, side 2 is pretty remarkable, really. All composed by Freddie, and you've got just these incredible songs, which when you think about it, Freddie had not been writing songs for all that long, you know. I think he wrote his first song in maybe 1969 or something like that. This is 1974. You know, the Fairy Fellas, Master Stroke, Ogre Battle, The March of the White Queen, and then the big hit single at the end, Seven Seas of Rye. Yeah, just one of those early 1970s classics, really. Queen 2. It could have come higher, but I wanted to showcase some other things. At number 6, another album that I toyed with putting at number 1, but again, it's one of those ones I kind of have to be in the mood for. So this is Randy Newman and Good Old Boys. I first cottoned onto this record from, again, it would have been an issue of Mojo magazine, I think, back in the early noughties or maybe in the late 90s, and they were asking David Byrne, what is your favourite album of all time? And he just name checked this one. I don't remember at the time whether I'd heard Randy Newman at that point. I think I probably had, but again, I just went out and bought this record, didn't know anything about it, and it's just a fantastic album. It's a sort of study of the American Deep South, really, with songs that are, as usual with Randy Newman, they're sort of acidic, acerbic, tongue-in-cheek. The opening song, Rednecks, which contains a word that you couldn't use anymore. It's a word which has drifted off the radar in terms of what's acceptable, and it does make me wince very slightly when I hear the song, but you know, it's meant to be a parody, it's meant to be satire. Just that great refrain, we're rednecks, rednecks, we don't know our ass from a hole in the ground. But it's mainly done in a good spirit. Randy Newman, he's got this kind of rolling New Orleansy piano style, and great orchestrations. Andy Newmark on drums, fantastic. Al Perkins on pedal steel. And yeah, it's just one of those records that you've got to hear, really. And I'm always a little bit in awe of Randy Newman. When I put one of his records on the turntable, I can never just listen to one song or two songs, have to listen to the whole thing. He's got a bit of a spellbinding quality, just this absolute mastery of song form, and his playing style and the way he orchestrates everything. Came from a very musical family as well, obviously, and then I think his father was a film composer, and then Randy went on to be a film composer. Slightly wasted, I think. I think writing songs for Toy Story, I'm sure it's worthy work and I'm sure it pays well, but I think Randy Newman is too great an artist for that kind of thing, really. Number 5, again, one that I toyed with putting at number 1. But I didn't. Steely Dan and Pretzel Logic. Love side 1 of this record. Doesn't put a foot wrong for me, really. This was the album that made me fall in love with Steely Dan. I got a few of their records, I think, but this is the one that I sort of ended up with it on rotation. And I just remember being in the kitchen one day doing the washing up, playing this album on CD. And just those opening tracks, Ricky Don't Lose That Number, Night by Night, and then Any Major Dude Will Tell You, that came on with that gorgeous, beautiful electric piano. Check out the cover version if you've not heard it. There's a great cover version of that by the alt country band Wilco, which is worth hearing. It's not as good as the Steely Dan version, but it's interesting to hear a band like Wilco, who are quite rootsy, covering Steely Dan, because they're probably the least rootsy band that you could think of. But yeah, just a fantastic vibe on that song. The kind of harmonic chord progressions that nobody else was doing at the time. I don't think it was just clever dickery. I think there's a bit of soul going on this album. On side 2, a couple of really interesting moments. Through with Buzz, which is a sort of Beatlesy song, really. Got a bit of a George Martin orchestration thing going on. Slightly reminds me of something that might have been on Band on the Run even. It's got a very McCartney-ish kind of vibe. Charlie Freak as well, which is just a great song about a kind of desultory drug dealer. And With a Gun, again a bit of a Beatlesy song, sounds a bit like I've Just Seen a Face from Help. This album sort of reminds me of Sheer Heart Attack by Queen. I think it's the record where they start to experiment and throw some interesting left turns, interesting songs into the mix. The first 2 albums have been great, and the second album in particular was quite progressive, but this is the one where they go pop, really, full-on pop, but still with the jazz side coming through. The opening song, Ricky Don't Lose That Number, obviously has the Horace Silver musical homage built into it, really. But yeah, just a great album, always been a favourite. Steely Dan and Pretzel Logic. Number 4, one that I thought could come top, but too bleak, I think, too bleak to come top. Have to be in the mood for it. Neil Young and On the Beach. This is one that I first got on CD when the CD reissue came out. It would have been in about 2002, something like that. And this, of course, had been the great lost album. It hadn't been reissued. It was impossible to find on vinyl. There was a whole generation of music listeners like myself who knew about the record but had never actually heard it. So when it was reissued on CD, everybody rushed out to buy it. I certainly did, and I just found it mesmerising. I copied it, had a tape of it in the car, and just listened to it non-stop for months. And then when the vinyl reissue came out, I snapped it up. One of Neil's most bleak albums, side 2 in particular. You've got the, just these songs, Motion Pictures, Ambulance Blues, just painfully slow, but they don't lose interest at all. In fact, the slower they get and the sparser they get, the more hypnotic they get. Really Neil singing the end of the 1960s, really, trying to express this idea of the death of the 60s dream, doing it very powerfully, for the Turnstiles, Vampire Blues. I love the opening song though, Walk On, but my favourite song of this album is the second track, See the Sky About to Rain, which is one of the most brilliant evocations of rain that you can imagine, just that feeling of staring out the window and noticing that the sky is about to rain. It has this lovely electronic keyboard part in it, I think it's a Rhodes piano maybe, really evokes the sound of rain falling, or rain about to fall. That's what's so great about the song, is that it does totally conjure up what it's about. So mesmerising record. I think probably my favourite album by Neil. This one and a couple of others, but yeah, definitely top shelf. Neil Young, which is why it's so high. Now, strangely enough, the next album is one that I picked up at the same time, almost exactly the same time as On the Beach, and I always associate them both together, but they're very, very different albums. So this is Red by King Crimson, and I'm not sure where this falls in their discography. It was maybe their 4th album. It was at the end of where they were just about to break up for the first time. Bill Bruford had not long joined the band. He'd been on a couple of records prior to this. I think he'd been on Lark's Tongue and Aspic, I think, and maybe another one or two. He left Yes to join King Crimson, made a few albums, and then Robert Fripp disbanded the group, and Bill found himself fully employed. But he did okay for himself. This album, when I first got it, like I said, I was listening to a lot of Neil Young on the beach. I was playing drums in a band at the time, and I was not too happy in the band I was in, and I was trying to work out, do I want to be in a band that sounds like On the Beach by Neil Young, or do I want to be in a band that sounds like King Crimson? And it seemed like a very important choice at the time, because totally different styles of drumming, totally different styles of music, and I couldn't make up my mind. This is just very, very dark, heavy, progressive. One More Red Nightmare just got some astonishing Bill Bruford drum fills on it, the way he phrases across bar lines, and just all sorts of textured stuff going on. But then side 2, the closing song, Starless, which goes into this rampant saxophone solo by Mel Collins. Ian MacDonald also on alto saxophone on here, of course. I just think an astonishing record. I know Kurt Cobain was a fan. I think this kicks Court of the Crimson King totally into touch. I think it's sonically much, much better, much more timeless. Doesn't have that sort of incense and kind of, I don't know, Hammond organ-y thing going on, which I find a little bit dated on the very early Crimson. But this one is very forward-looking, forward-thinking, very modern, very dark, and just great fun. Great fun in a dark way, entertaining. King Crimson coming in at number 3. Could have come at number 1. Right, so the final 2, they could swap round on a different day. I put this one at number 2 because I think the number 1 album that I've got probably had more of an impact on me when I was growing up. But this one did have an impact when I was in my teens. I first heard it in, I think it was 1987, 1988. This is Electric Light Orchestra and El Dorado, their 4th album, the first one to go gold, the first album that was a hit for them in America. First one where they used a big 30-piece, I think, string orchestra. But the orchestrations on this album are they're just fantastic. Jeff Lynne, Richard Tandy and the orchestrator Louis Clark worked on them together. They lift various themes and various bits and pieces from various pieces of music. I think it's Grieg's Piano Concerto is weaved into the opening El Dorado Overture, but there's all sorts of really huge sort of Tchaikovskyan romantic or orchestrations going on, very, very different to what they'd done before. The first 3 albums were strange, unnerving at times, baroque kind of prog art pop. This was this is something different. This was edging into totally different territory. Definitely roots in the Moody Blues from the late 60s. But for my money, I think Jeff sort of took it one stage further. I think he kind of he took it to its logical conclusion with his album, and it's got some extremely big, huge moments on it. The closing song, El Dorado, which was the B-side of Wild West Hero in 1977, it's just incredible. I guess the most famous song from it is Can't Get It Out of My Head, which was a top 10 single in America, and it's a song that Jeff wrote to impress his father, because his dad had always accused him of writing songs that had no tunes. So he ended up writing that song. He said, I'll show you a tune then, and he wrote that song to prove to his dad that he could do this fantastic sort of Paul McCartney-ish, just huge melodic tour de force. And yeah, I just think it's astonishing, you know, all composed by Jeff, produced by him, you know, him playing the guitars and singing, and a sort of Brian Wilson-esque level of just visionary pop amazingness. So anyway, El Dorado coming in at number 2. Number 1 edges it for me, because when I was growing up, when I was younger than that, when I was more like 10, 11, 12, I mean, this just did not leave my turntable for about a year or two. Sheer Heart Attack, Queen's third album. I don't think it's a perfect album. I think side 2 could have done with another 1 or 2 great songs on it. Side 2 goes into this very hell for leather, fast, kind of almost like a medley approach again. The record has got a kind of nervous energy to it. Brian May, at the time, had been suffering from various maladies. He'd had hepatitis, he'd had a duodenal ulcer, he was out of the band for several months in hospital while the other 3 guys were kind of scratching around, trying to find material to record until Brian could come back. That's why they ended up recording Stone Cold Crazy, which had been a song that had been in their set list even from before Freddie joined, maybe, I think, or from very, very early days. And you know, John Deacon had his first song on this record, Misfire, which is a really nice little song. Freddie, of course, wrote the monster hit Killer Queen, which Brian didn't like. When Brian came back to the studio finally to start recording, he didn't like Killer Queen. He thought it was too light, and he made them re-record all the vocal parts, or the harmony parts anyway, he thought were just too pop, too soft. Flick of the Wrist, great heavy rock song. Now I'm Here at the end of side 1. The songs that bookend side 2, sorry, in the Lap of the Gods and In the Lap of the Gods Revisited, just magisterial, really, and quite sort of visionary. Freddie going one step further, I think, than he'd done on Queen 2, working out a way of doing things that was a bit easier to digest. On Queen 2, everything came at you all in one big kind of blob. On this record, Freddie is learning to sort of pull things apart a little bit and shoot things at the listener. Short, snappy songs, one after another, rather than trying to do these big symphonic things. But it does end with this monstrous song, In the Lap of the Gods Revisited, with this huge massed chorus. Just the 3 of them, just Freddie, Brian and Roger singing, overdubbed and then overdubbed again, until you get this big, massive, vengeful choir kind of sound and this huge blaze of doomsday static at the end. An album which it's sort of a bit played out for me now, to be honest with you, but I couldn't resist having it on my list in the top spot. So there we go. Steve did have this one, but he didn't have it at number 1, but I thought I would stick it up there. So there we go. The video is longer than I'd intended it to be, but I guess that's what happens when you do a top 20. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Please do leave me some comments. Let me know what you think of my choices. Let me know what you think would go on your list that's different or the same, as the case may be. And that's it for now. I will say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.